A silence grips the forest. The pines groan beneath the weight of snow, and the night air burns the lungs with every breath. Out there, among the ridges and frozen lakes, something moves, a gaunt shadow with eyes like embers, ribs sharp as knife blades pressing through skin, its breath frosting the air in clouds of hunger. The Wendigo is not just a story. It is starvation with a face. It is famine given legs, and it has been following humanity for nearly 3,000 years. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. If you're into this kind of deep dive, tap like and subscribe. Here is the hook. This is not a monster born in Hollywood. It is not even a European werewolf in borrowed clothes. The Wendigo's roots run into the soil of Algonquian languages and the lived experience of winters that could kill. When game disappeared and temperatures plunged to 30 below, when survival meant sharing or starving, a word emerged. In Ojibwe, it was Wendigo, a winter cannibal monster. In Cree, Witcow giant, eater of human flesh. And in their common ancestor, Proto-Algonquian, scholars reconstruct a form like Wintekowa, already circulating around 800 years before Christ. That makes the idea almost 2,900 years old. But let's bring it into the present tense, as the people who lived with this fear told it. In one story, a hunter loses his way in the endless pine forest. Hunger gnaws at his belly. Snow crunches beneath his snowshoes like breaking glass. A whisper slides between the trees. Wendigo. He sees prints in the drifts, each step twice the span of his own, leading deeper into the black timber. The wind carries the scent of carrion. He runs, but no matter how far, the prints stay just ahead. When at last he staggers into his village, his eyes are hollow, his words fractured. He is not the same man who left. The Jesuit relations, missionary reports written in the 1630s, captured fragments of this fear. Among the Montagnais, they recorded the Atchan, a giant who devoured people when the cold struck hardest. The French priests interpreted it through their demonology, branding it a devil in the snow. Yet to the Innu, the Atchan was not only a tale to frighten children, it was a reminder of what hunger could make of a person. Fast forward to the 19th century. A man named Swift Runner is brought to trial in Fort Saskatchewan. It is the winter of 1879. He has confessed to killing and eating his family during starvation. Witnesses say he spoke of the Wendigo. His execution is written into Canadian newspapers as a lurid crime, but for Indigenous communities, it confirmed what elders had always warned. The Wendigo was not fiction. It was what happened when greed and hunger twisted the human heart. Pause here. Why does this matter to us? Because the Wendigo is more than a monster in a horror story. It is a cultural memory of survival on the razor's edge. It is a code embedded in language that told people what not to become. And across centuries, colonizers, priests, fur traders, and later pulp authors would reshape the being until it looked almost unrecognizable. A flicker of firelight in a trapper's cabin. A voyager whispers a tale beside the crackling spruce logs. The Wendigo leaves tracks that stretch for miles, faster than any man can run. Its hunger grows with every meal, until its body is taller than the tallest pine. But here's the twist: no matter how much it eats, it is always starving. Can you imagine a worse fate than eating endlessly and never being full? The novelist Algernon Blackwood seized on that exact terror in 1910. His story, The Wendigo, brought the monster into English horror canon. A group of men in the Canadian bush feel pursued by a thing they cannot see. They hear its cry in the night wind, and one of them is carried away, leaving only elongated footprints and the stench of decay. Blackwood gave the Anglophone world the name Wendigo, locking in a spelling that most of us know today. But the true origins go deeper back past Blackwood, past Swift Runner, past the Jesuit relations to Proto-Algonquian words spoken before Rome rose, or Homer sang, nearly 3,000 years of survival encoded in one idea. When famine comes, beware the Wendigo. So the cliffhanger is this: if the Wendigo is that old, where exactly do we see it first? And how did a whispered Algonquian word survive colonization, fur trade stories, pulp fiction, and modern horror to arrive on our screens today? The trail of the Wendigo through history begins in ink, thick strokes of Latin and French letters scratched into the Jesuit relations of the 1630s. Picture the scene: a mission cabin in Quebec, the smell of damp wool steaming by the fire, quills dipped into inkpots while snow taps the shutters. Jesuit missionaries sit across from Montagnais Innu elders, who describe the Atchan, a gaunt, human-like giant that hunts when the cold is most cruel. To the priests, the story becomes a convenient sermon illustration. The devil prowls even in the forests, they write, translating indigenous belief into their own theology. But what slips between the lines is something older and more complex, a being tied not to abstract sin but to the real terror of starvation. This is the first secure written horizon, 1634 to 1636. That means, as of 2025, the Wendigo has been on paper for almost 400 years. Yet even then, it is already ancient. The Jesuits themselves noted the idea was not new to the people they spoke with. It had been carried orally through winters long before a quill ever recorded it. By the early 18th century, traces of the name Wendigo begin seeping into English records. The Oxford English Dictionary points to references as early as 1714. Later, in the early 1900s, Algernon Blackwood would crystallise the modern spelling. Between those two poles, missionary accounts and weird fiction, we glimpse how oral warnings became textual artefacts, then literary horror. But the Wendigo's journey through colonial hands was never neutral. Hudson's Bay Company clerks, voyageurs, and traders in the fur country carried the tale westward. Imagine a frozen post on the Red River or Lake Superior, pemmican stewing in a blackened pot, fiddle scraping a tune while snow gathers at the door. Around the fire, men swap stories. Loup Garou, the werewolf from France, the Wendigo, the cannibal giant from the north. These tales blend, morphing into cautionary folklore for a workforce perpetually on the edge of exhaustion and hunger. This is where the story takes on a second life. For the voyageurs, the Wendigo wasn't just a monster, it was a symbol. It embodied the consequences of selfishness in a world where survival depended on sharing rations and pulling together. Lose sight of that ethic, and you risked becoming the very thing everyone feared. Podruchny, writing in 2004, argued that Wendigo stories in fur trade country doubled as morality tales about masculinity, hunger, and work discipline. And yet, the transmission came at a cost. Jesuit translators often reframed indigenous healing rites as exorcisms, where an elder might perform a sweat lodge cure, wrapping an afflicted person in rabbit skin and feeding them broth to warm the heart. Missionaries saw only a battle against demons. By the 19th century, children's books retelling Chennu tales would omit cannibalism entirely, replacing it with vague monster hunger that dulled the edge of the warning. Even so, the oral traditions persisted. Among the OG Cree, the verb Wendigoe meant he or she is becoming a Wendigo. It was not just a fixed monster, but a process possession, transformation, moral collapse. And in Cree communities, the word Witikau could still mean either cannibal giant or simply a greedy person. The term itself carried dual weight, a literal monster and a social metaphor. But here's where it gets stranger. The deeper we trace the language, the older the horizon becomes. Linguists reconstruct a Proto-Algonquian ancestor, Wintekowa, spoken somewhere between 1000 and 500 BCE. That places the root concept close to 2900 years old. In some branches, the word meant owl. In others, it meant cannibal spirit. How could a single word travel such distances in meaning? Was it the eerie cry of an owl on a winter night that became tangled with starvation fears? Or did the cannibal spirit itself wear the bird as its omen? Dahlstrom in 2003 noted this semantic drift, but left the origin unresolved. So, by the time Blackwood published his novella in 1910, the Wendigo had passed through at least 4 transformations: oral survival lore, Jesuit demon, fur trade campfire tale, and finally horror fiction daemon. And yet the beating heart of the story, the winter hunger that no feast can satisfy, remained intact. Now ask yourself this: if the Jesuits in the 1630s found the idea already ancient, and if linguistic reconstructions push its roots back nearly 3 millennia, what exactly is the true age of the Wendigo? And how do we classify a being that is less a fairy tale than a living survival code? Picture a snowfield at dawn. Every tree rhymed in frost so heavy it looks like crystal. You hear a branch snap deep in the forest. Was it a deer? Or something taller, hungrier, less forgiving? To unravel the Wendigo's riddle, we have to step back, not into the forest this time, but into the filing cabinets of folklorists and the comparative grids of linguists. Because if this monster really is 2,900 years old, we need to see how that number was calculated. First, the math. The earliest secure written reference is from the Jesuit Relations of 1634. Count forward to 2025, and that's nearly 391 years. Old, but not ancient. The deeper horizon comes from Proto-Algonquian. Scholars like Siddiqui and Brightman Place the common language around 1000 to 500 BCE. Split the difference, and you're around 875 BCE, about 29 centuries ago. That's the 2,900-year claim in our title. The monster's name, not just its story, may have been alive in the mouths of hunters on snow-covered trails centuries before Rome was a republic. Folklorists, however, run into a problem. The Wendigo is not a single tidy tale like Cinderella or Little Red Riding Hood. You won't find it listed as ATU Type 327 in Uther's catalogue. Instead, it floats across categories. Stith Thompson's motif index groups cannibal ogres under G10 to G49. Some versions, like the Eastern Algonquian Chenu with its ice heart, fit under E710, the external soul motif. A few hunting stories echo ATU 327, the children and the ogre, with people escaping a predator through trickery. But these are approximations. Indigenous traditions don't slot neatly into European taxonomies. That mismatch matters. To label the Wendigo simply as a fairy tale monster flattens its function. Among the Ojibwe, the very verb windigowi could describe a human falling into possession. That is more than myth. It's a diagnosis. In Cree, the same word carried moral weight, describing both an actual man-eating giant and, metaphorically, a greedy person who hoards food while others starve. Compare that to Thompson's sterile code G11, cannibal ogre. You can feel the cultural gap, but classification attempts do reveal patterns. Across Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Wendigo always clusters around four motifs: winter, famine, cannibalism, and excess. The Jesuit relations saw it among the Montagnais Innu. Leland in 1884 wrote of the Chenu, icy-hearted giants in Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy tales. Abenaki traditions called them Kiwakwa or Jiwakwa, again tied to hunger and ice. OG Cree accounts stress transformation, ordinary people sliding into Wendigo being under pressure of hunger. Taken together, they show a web of stories, not a single plotline, but united by one moral warning: unchecked hunger destroys both body and soul. And the age math isn't the only surprise. Etymology complicates things. The Proto-Algonquian reconstruction, Wintikowa, has been argued to mean owl in some branches. Owls in boreal night are eerie presences, their calls echoing across frozen lakes. Did the owl stand first as a death omen, then morph into a cannibal spirit? Or did both meanings exist side by side, feeding off each other? Dahlström's 2003 analysis found evidence in both directions, leaving the puzzle unsolved. What we do know is that the Wendigo was already old by the time Europeans stumbled onto it. Its story does not begin with Blackwood, or even with Swift Runner, but in a time when languages had not yet split into Cree, Ojibwe, Arapaho, Cheyenne, or Fox. Imagine that. A single word carrying forward for nearly 3,000 years, surviving migrations, colonial pressures, and modern retellings, always circling the same fear. So here's the real question. If the Wendigo is not just a myth, but a moral code, and if it bridges the gap between cannibal ogre and metaphor for greed, what does that reveal about the cultures that preserved it? And more intriguingly, what other civilizations half a world away were wrestling with the same hunger-haunted monsters at the same time? A fire snaps inside a bark lodge, its light playing on faces that lean close as the story of the Wendigo unfolds. Now imagine moving far from the boreal forest, crossing oceans and centuries, and still finding cousins of this hunger giant haunting the human imagination. The Wendigo is not alone. Other cultures, too, have given form to the terror of famine and the shadow of greed. Start with the Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy of the East Coast. Their Chenu giants are towering cannibals with hearts of ice. In some tales, warriors defeat them with arrow and axe. In others, redemption is possible. By feeding them warm broth or showing them kindness, the ice heart melts, and the monster becomes human again. Collected in print by Charles Leland in 1884, these stories carry the same core elements: winter, hunger, cannibalism, but add the twist of cure. Unlike the endless hunger of the Wendigo, the Chenu leaves room for salvation. Shift west and north, and you find the Athabascan Wet'suwet'en. This being stalks the forests of what is now northwestern Canada, tied to different rituals but sharing cannibal traits. In OG Cree lands, meanwhile, the monster is not always external. Windigowi, he or she, is becoming a Wendigo describes possession. The enemy may be your own neighbour, even your own kin, transformed by hunger and desire. That internal focus, sets it apart from the Chenu's towering ice giant or the Jesuits' demon in the snow. Beyond North America, parallels multiply. Across Eurasia, stories of cannibal ogres abound. ATU 327, The Children and the Ogre, includes the Italian Orco, the Russian Baba Yaga in her devouring guise, and the Scandinavian trolls who eat the unwary. Thompson's motif codes for cannibal ogres stretch from G10 to G49, showing just how widespread the archetype is. Each culture, in its own way, made hunger monstrous, and yet the Wendigo differs in its moral edge. Where European ogres are brute predators, the Wendigo often starts as a human. It is the warning of transformation, the moment when desperation, greed, or selfishness tips someone into monstrosity. That is why, in Cree usage, Wittikau can mean both cannibal giant and greedy person. The double meaning carries a social lesson: share food, resist excess, or risk becoming the very thing that destroys community. Cross to ancient China and you meet the Jiangshi, the hopping vampire, a being tied to hunger and improper burials. Travel to Polynesia, and cannibal spirits appear in origin myths as forces of chaos, barely controlled by gods. In Norse myth, there is Fenrir, the wolf whose endless appetite threatens the cosmos itself. Each one is different, but they rhyme with the Wendigo's essential fear: hunger without end. But here's where the Algonquian traditions sharpen the comparison. While ogres and vampires threaten from the outside, the Wendigo is a mirror. It shows communities what can happen inside their own tents, their own families, their own hearts. It is the horror of looking across the fire at someone you love and wondering if famine has already begun to change them. Consider the geography: harsh boreal winters, temperatures plunging to 30 below, caribou migrations breaking, fish runs failing. In those conditions, the line between survival and collapse was thin. Cannibalism panics, recorded even in colonial newspapers in the Lesser Slave and Peace River districts, were not simply superstition. They were responses to real hunger crises. The Wendigo, then, functioned as both supernatural explanation and practical warning: do not cross that line. What makes this cross-cultural echo more unsettling is that we recognize it in ourselves. Greed in a corporate boardroom, consumption that devours the planet's resources, addictions that hollow out communities. Modern writers speak of Wetiko, a borrowing of the Cree term, as a metaphor for destructive excess. The ancient giant of the snow still whispers in new forms. So the cliffhanger is this: if the Wendigo is not just a monster but a moral lens, then every object in its story, the ice heart, the gaunt frame, the endless appetite, must carry symbolic weight. What exactly did these communities see when they looked into the eyes of the Wendigo, and how did their rituals try to fight it? A frostbitten silence presses over the boreal forest. In Mi'kmaq lore, when hunters discover a Chenu, they know the key lies not in brute force alone, but in the heart, an actual block of ice lodged inside the monster's chest. Break it, and the creature dies. Melt it, and sometimes the being can be restored to humanity. That ice heart is more than a plot device. It is a symbol. It makes hunger visible, as if the cold itself had taken root inside the body. Among Cree communities, elders explained the Wendigo as more than a towering cannibal. It could mean simply a greedy person, someone who hoards food while others starve. Language itself framed selfishness as a kind of monster. In winters, when a 30 degrees cold snaps killed game and broke the cycle of survival, generosity was not just kindness, it was life insurance. To call someone Wittikau was to accuse them of endangering everyone. The symbols pile up. North is always the Wendigo's direction, winter is its season, gluttony is its sin. A gaunt frame that grows taller with every meal it eats and eats, yet the hunger only deepens. Imagine that as a metaphor. The more you consume, the emptier you become. It is the inverse of a feast. Instead of satiety, each bite makes the void larger. Encyclopedia entries today still repeat it. The Wendigo embodies insatiable hunger. And there were ways to fight back. Picture a curing rite. A person suspected of becoming Wendigo is wrapped in a rabbit-skin blanket. Elders beat the drum, their voices rising in song, the smoke of sweetgrass curling upward in the dark lodge. A broth is spooned carefully into the mouth of the afflicted, an attempt to warm the heart. What looks to outsiders like exorcism was, in indigenous frames, medicine, both literal warmth and symbolic reintegration. Carlson's ethnographies in the early 2000s preserve these echoes of therapeutic practice. Contrast that with the Jesuits. When they recorded such rites in the 1700s, They translated them into demonology. To their eyes, a Wendigo was simply a devil, and the drum was an exorcist bell. That flattening of meaning reveals not just cultural misunderstanding, but colonial silencing. By the 19th century, print retellings for children scrubbed away the cannibalism entirely, turning the Wendigo into a generic snow giant. The symbolism of hunger, greed, and cold had been bleached out, yet within indigenous traditions, the object still carried weight. The owl, perhaps a remnant of the Proto-Algonquian root, served as a herald. Hear an owl call on a winter night, and you might whisper that a Wendigo was near. Fire, by contrast, was the counterforce: warmth, sharing, cooking, community. Even the snowshoes creaking on hard crust could become ominous if the tracks ahead grew too large, too long, too fast to be human. But here's the unsettling angle. If the ice heart was symbolic of greed frozen into the body, how do we read Swift Runner's case in the late 1870s? He confessed to cannibalism during a winter of starvation and spoke of the Wendigo. Was his act a literal possession, a psychosis? Or was he expressing, in the only cultural framework available, the terrible pull of hunger? The courtroom in Fort Saskatchewan hanged him as a murderer. The community around him whispered of a Wendigo. Symbols cross thresholds. The gaunt frame becomes a metaphor for famine. The ice heart becomes an allegory for selfishness. The drum becomes medicine, not magic. What looks like folklore is in fact a survival guide written in image and sound. So we arrive at the hinge. The Wendigo is both monster and mirror, both symbol and social law. But how has this ambiguity fueled centuries of debate? And how much of what we think we know antlers, hooves, deer skulls comes not from indigenous tradition at all, but from outsiders reshaping the legend to fit their own fears? A figure looms in pop culture posters, antlers branching like dead trees, a skull mask stretched over a skeletal face. That is what most people today picture when they hear Wendigo. But here's the surprise, none of that belongs to the indigenous record. Cree, Ojibwe, Innu, or Abenaki elders never described antlers or deer skulls. Britannica's 2025 digest is clear. The Wendigo in tradition is gaunt, frostbitten, human-like, sometimes giant. The antlered beast is a cinematic invention, borrowed from horror aesthetics. This is not the only distortion. In the mid-20th century, psychiatrists coined the phrase Wendigo psychosis. It described a supposed culture-bound syndrome in which individuals believed themselves possessed by a craving for human flesh. Case studies were written. Swift Runner and Jack Fiddler's stories were reinterpreted. By the 1980s, scholars like Morano and Brightman pushed back. They argued that the diagnosis over-pathologized indigenous people, reducing a complex spiritual and social system to a mental illness category palatable to Western medicine. Carlson, in 2009, cautioned that while Athabasca records show verifiable Witico conditions, no single Western theory explains them all. Missteps go further back. Missionary pens as early as the 1700s flattened curing rites into exorcism, erasing indigenous therapeutic practices. Children's anthologies, from the 19th century onward, softened Cheno tales into harmless snow giants, stripping away the cannibalism that gave the story its moral weight. Each layer of editing pushed the Wendigo further from its cultural roots. Even etymology is contested. Brightman noted that some tried linking Strachey's Wintuk in a Virginia Algonquian word list from 1612 to Wintekowa, but linguists like Goddard caution against conflation. The sound similarities may be coincidental. The Virginian word might have meant something entirely different. Dahlstrom's analysis of owl versus cannibal spirit senses in Proto-Algonquian underlines the risk of reading too much into fragile reconstructions. Meanwhile, colonial law clashed violently with indigenous protocols. In 1907, Oji-Cree headman Jack Fiddler was arrested for murder. He claimed he had performed mercy killings of people believed to have become Wendigos. For his community, this was a way of protecting others. For the Canadian courts, it was a crime. Fiddler died in custody, his case marking a moment when the Wendigo crossed from indigenous cosmology into the machinery of colonial justice. What lingers is a pattern. Each outsider encounter reframes the Wendigo into something it was not. Jesuits call it devilry, doctors call it psychosis, horror writers call it a deer-headed forest god. And yet, inside Algonquian languages, the meaning is still there. In Cree dictionaries, Witikau remains both cannibal monster and greedy person. In Ojibwe speech, Wendigo still names hunger embodied. So, here's the tension. When you think of the Wendigo, Are you seeing a gaunt, frost-bleached human figure from centuries of indigenous warning tales? Or are you seeing a Hollywood horror with antlers, something invented in the 20th century? Which version tells us more about survival, about greed, about human limits? That is why accuracy matters. To retell the Wendigo is not to decorate it with skulls and shadows, but to remember the families huddled in fir lodges at 30° C, whispering that starvation had a face. And that sets up our last cliff. If the Wendigo is not merely a monster, but a mirror of community fears and human excess, then why has it endured so powerfully? What makes this story survive 3,000 years, migrating from fur camps to novels to video games? What keeps us looking into the forest and wondering if hunger still walks there? The snow is falling again. A line of tracks winds into the black spruce, longer and wider than any human step. A traveller pauses, peers into the trees, and feels that familiar shiver. The Wendigo is near. Why does this image gaunt, insatiable, faceless hunger still seize us today, 3,000 years after its first whisper in Proto-Algonquian tongues? Part of the answer is survival. For Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Wendigo encoded memory of famine winters when 30° C cold could snap the caribou cycle or freeze lakes solid. It was a teaching story and a warning. Share your food, resist greed, or the hunger will consume you from the inside. Anthropologist Brightman, writing in 1988, argued that famine and trade crises created the soil in which the Wendigo flourished. It was not just myth, it was an ethical compass. But there is also psychology. The Wendigo embodies what we fear most in ourselves: desire without limit, eating that never fills, greed that never ends. In Cree speech, Witikow is both cannibal giant and selfish person. In modern discourse, Witiko has been borrowed as a critique of capitalism, colonial extraction, and environmental destruction. A monster once born in the boreal forest now stalks boardrooms and oil fields, reminding us that the hunger never left it, just changed form. The endurance is also literary. In 1910, Algernon Blackwood gave English readers The Wendigo, with its elongated footprints, carrion stench, and unearthly cry. Lovecraft and Derleth borrowed those traits for the Cthulhu mythos, reshaping the Wendigo into Ithaqua. By the late 20th century, horror films and video games had turned it into a pop culture staple, antlers, skulls, and all. Most of those details are inventions, but the core idea, an unstoppable hunger in human form, remains magnetic. And then there is ritual. Imagine an afflicted person, wrapped in a rabbit-skin blanket while elders drum and smudge with sweetgrass. The song rises, broth warms the lips, the heart is thawed. These are acts of care, community pulling someone back from the edge. Carlson's work in the early 2000s shows that these ceremonies weren't just superstition, they were medicine, psychological and social. They remind us that stories can heal as well as terrify. So why does the Wendigo endure? Because it is more than a monster. It is a mirror of human extremes. It warns us what famine can do. It scolds us when greed overreaches. It returns, century after century, because the conditions it describes never vanish. Every winter, every crisis, every excess brings the Wendigo back. And here is the final twist. The Wendigo may be 2,900 years old, but it is not finished. It is alive in language, in stories, in the icy silence of northern nights, and in our own struggles against excess and hunger. We keep the Wendigo alive because deep down, we know it still speaks to us. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.